Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the NWA Deterrence Center. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, co-founder and vice president for research at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. The NWA Deterrence Center is a 501c3 organization ensuring a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent and its ongoing modernization. Thank you for listening and welcome to the show. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to another exciting episode of NucleCast. Of course, as always, I am still Adam Lowther. And today, as every single episode, we have a great guest. Of course, I'm talking about Brigadier General retired Greg Bowen, who was the Deputy J3 at STRATCOM. He was the AEAO at one point, and so he, of course, fought many simulated nuclear conflicts in that position. So he's familiar with how we would actually fight a nuclear conflict. And the reason that Greg is with us today is because on a previous episode of NucleCast, I had Kyle Balzer and we talked about slick 'em in and hedging. And based on that, Greg listened to it and was like, hey, I've got some thoughts on that. And he sent me, his comments. And I said, well, hey, Greg, those are great comments. You need to come on NucleCast and let's talk about it because, of course, we're here to inform as well as entertain. And so Greg decided, yeah, that'd be a great topic. And so here he is. And we're going to discuss, of course, the topic is hedging. So, Greg, thanks for coming on NucleCast to talk about that.
Yeah, it's great, Adam. Thank you for the invite again. And I appreciate you putting up with my email rant after your discussion with Kyle. That was a very rich discussion. I really got a lot out of that, but it did trigger a couple of thoughts in my head that I was needing to share with somebody. So you were on the other end of the email. So I'm glad to be back, and I've been really enjoying the NucleCast interviews that you've been doing because it's really refreshing for me knowing that there are more than just a few of us deterrence geeks out there. It's a topic now that people are starting to talk about. 10, 12 years ago when I really started to study the topic, there weren't many people out there. Dr. Keith Payne kind of became my favorite guy. But there weren't a lot of people talking about it outside of Omaha. Now there are, and I think what you're doing is really helping to spread the word a little bit. So I appreciate being on today.
Oh, yeah. So let's get into the topic, of course. So hedging, explain to me why hedging is important and why the president needs options.
Okay, so as prudent military planners, we try to anticipate things that may happen. So we have plans, but as we like to say, the enemy gets a vote. And there's no way that you can plan for every possible permutation of things that may go down in a conflict. So you want to have in your strategy a hedge process whereby you can quickly react to some unforeseen thing that may come up. So kind of that's sort of the broad stroke of why we need to hedge, because there are things that could happen that we didn't foresee. Specifically, though, what triggered in my head after listening to your interview with Kyle was kind of two things. The first one, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, are the known unknowns. So that's one piece, and that has to do with the Triad recapitalization. And then the second piece is options and why options are so important. And I don't think the discussion on options gets a lot of traction, and nobody seems to be talking about that. But I think it's really, really critical. And if I were president for a day, I would want as many options as I could possibly come up with. And I can talk a little bit more about why that's important.
Well, let's do that. So explain, when Rumsfeld said that, he very famously talked about his known unknowns and his unknown unknowns, and we have both. And then, he also said that weakness is provocative, which is
Indeed.
Perhaps the thing that I think was the most prescient thing he ever said was weakness is provocative, which sort of goes to your point of the importance of hedging and options. So go into more detail, explain that. And, as somebody who's actually played many iterations of our our scenarios, our simulations. You've sort of seen and experienced it. Give us detail, give us some depth and breadth to why this matters.
Okay, so just for context, in my time at Stratcom, I had 2 additional duties, if you will, in addition to being the Deputy J3. One, I was one of the designated command alternates, or DCAs, and the purpose of the DCAs is to be able to stand in for the commander at the headquarters, briefing the president if for some reason the commander is not available, which is highly unlikely given the comm package that he travels with. So there were a number of us general and flag officers in the headquarters that had to get certified to do that job, and that was performed on the battle deck in the Stratcom headquarters with all of the vast array of information presented to us on the knowledge walls and the whole staff to back us up. That was DCA. The Airborne Emergency Action Officer is the general or flag officer that flies on the Stratcom Airborne Command Post, or Looking Glass is kind of the moniker of the mission. And when you're doing the AEAO job, you're essentially the Stratcom commander, and the small battle staff that I had on the jet with me, which was less than 10 people, we did the entire thing from soup to nuts. You fought the entire war from the jet, and that included briefing the president, obtaining decisions, executing the orders, and then all of the back end stuff that you don't think about. Where are the bombers going to land when they come back? Their main operating base is probably a smoking hole in the ground, so you have to find a place to land them. You got to get tankers. You got to do things with submarines. There was a whole myriad of things that you did on the jet. And after my couple of years there, I fought several dozens of nuclear wars, and they're very intense. They're very immersive. And the Joint Staff and Stratcom J7 exercise planners came up with some scenarios that were really, really difficult problems. And the role players that played the roles of the various people on the conference, you could very easily lose yourself for a minute and forget that you're in a training exercise. It was excellent. It was phenomenal, but it was hard. So kind of that. So I'm going to start with the options piece, and then we'll go back to the known unknowns. So when the president is presented with a problem, we've already got a set of pre-planned options that the president can choose from, and it's fairly extensive. But again, you can't cover every single permutation of what might happen, and we do have the ability to rapidly plan new options if needed, both at the headquarters, and we could do it on the Abencap jet for things like a time-sensitive target. You find a road mobile ICBM somewhere and you want to take it out. We can very quickly plan an option for that, but it does take some time, and it can potentially take away from other things. So it's really important to have just as many possible options for the president to choose from as we possibly can. And the example that I'll give you is there was quite a bit of discussion about the low yield SLBM, right? And why did we need that? Well, I was at Stratcom when we did that scenario that ended up driving the decision to ask the Joint Staff for that capability. And the particular, I obviously can't tell you the particulars of the scenario, but I can tell you it was an escalation control scenario, which were always the worst ones. I hated those. If it's on like Donkey Kong Nuclear War, that's pretty easy from my perspective as the guy that had to do it. But when you have to go through this escalation control, it's very, very touchy, because you want to respond, or advise the president, I should say more correctly, to respond in a way that shows resolve yet doesn't make the adversary want to shoot back some more. We want to punch them in the face and want them to back away from the table at that point, and then let the diplomats do what they do. It's very, very challenging. So there was one particular scenario, and if I recall correctly, it was one of the ones where General Hyten was actually in the chair doing his job, because he had to practice too. These are perishable skills, so even the Stratcom commander gets a chance in the hot seat. And it was a really devilishly difficult escalation control scenario, and it would have been really helpful to have a low yield option that we could quickly employ in a denied area to make a statement.
Right.
But we didn't have it. And that led to all kinds of discussions in the after action review of, well, what if we had this or that? And that sort of generated the whole idea behind the low yield SLBM option. So it's giving the president, whoever the president is, I don't care, whoever is in that chair on that fateful day, we need to be able to give that person the maximum number of tools in the toolkit to deal with a problem. And that's one of the reasons I'm a huge fan of the SLCM N, because it allows for some other options that we don't currently have. We wouldn't, and I'm in favor of putting them on attack submarines because we don't have to expose our boomers that way. And there's more attack submarines, and it gives you more vectors and makes it a more difficult decision calculus for our adversaries. I think it enhances deterrence greatly, but it also gives you some really good additional options that we wouldn't have with other weapon systems. So that was kind of the crux of what went through my head as I was listening to you and Kyle talk about the SLCM N. Is that thing, we need to build a bunch of them, and we need to get them out there, and they come in very handy.
So the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review says that the United States will eliminate the hedge, the reserve warheads, this broader hedge that we have. Now, as you've been talking, you said, hey, we need SLCM in, but it's more than we need SLCM in. Explain more about that.
Well, so since the Nuclear Posture Review, in the 2022 version in particular, I think there's been kind of a seismic shift in the thinking about the adversary a little bit more. And it really started when Admiral Richard was the STRATCOM commander, and he went and testified in front of Congress and talked about the breathtaking pace of the Chinese nuclear breakout and the difficulty in solving the three-body problem. That is exceedingly hard to do. So I view, at least from my perspective, having done that, if I ever had, and I didn't ever have to face two nuclear armed threats at the same time, in our training scenarios, we were fighting one group at a time. But we always maintained a certain number of weapons for what we called third-party deterrence. So if we're in a fight with country A and country B decides that they want to start acting up because they see us as vulnerable, we can still deter them from doing that. So, but having all these different delivery methods, different sized warheads, having all of these things in a complex set of options that the president could bring to bear in a situation, I think is absolutely critical. And I know there's lots of arms control folks out there that absolutely want nothing to do with any of that sort of thing. New weapons, new delivery systems, they want to get rid of them. The problem is there's the world that we want and there's the world that we have. And I live in the real world, and we've got to be able to deal with these threats. So for me, it's a no-brainer, but I'm in charge of nothing.
Well, and it, at least to my mind, it goes back to that, Rumsfeld statement, weakness is provocative. And in particular, authoritarian regimes, because you essentially have three Asian authoritarian regimes in Russia, China, North Korea. And in many respects, they're, while they're very clearly different nations with different languages, different cultures, different histories, different religious or moral values, they're still run by authoritarians. And authoritarians have one principal objective, which is to remain in power. And authoritarian regimes have commonalities. That's, sort of part of Russian, Chinese, and North Korean strategic culture and history. And this idea that by demonstrating to them that we mean no harm and that we don't wish to destroy them. Or, in the case of the Russians, there are many Russians who believe Americans want to, kill them and then take their land and live in Siberia or other parts of Russia, which Americans don't want. So how do we, move beyond this idea that, good intentions are enough, and that we have to hedge? We need the warheads to then put on the delivery vehicles to then effectively deter. And for me, at least, I don't see it as a three-body problem. I sort of see it as still a two-body problem. I just see you don't have the Soviet Union. You have three authoritarians to deal with, but essentially it's an authoritarian East. And so I'm not so certain that you have to do a lot completely differently than you did before, because I think the same basic principles still apply. Authoritarians want to remain alive and in power, and that hasn't changed.
True. However, I guess I'd add a couple things. So you really hit on the key point in deterrence is what can we threaten that is valuable to them, and regime survival, as you pointed out, is the top thing for them. But what concerns me is you've got these authoritarian leaders who are beginning to align, particularly China and Russia. You can make an argument on North Korea and China, but I think that relationship is not as tight as some people may think it is. Sure. And then let us not forget Iran, with everything going on in the Middle East right now, the Iranians are probably thinking hard about, what are they going to do vis-a-vis the Israelis, and where are they going to fall? Is there going to be some kind of a quad group of leaders that are going to be thinking similarly and think of it like an Article 5 NATO, right? So an attack on one is an attack on all. Well, are they going to come up with some kind of a construct, with their little evil empire, with the four of them and have something similar? And if that is the case, then we do have the three-body problem to deal with.
Yeah. So before we take a quick break, I wanted to ask, so you can respond after the break, is we think about the hedge. First of all, explain what that means. For those who may not understand, when we say the hedge, explain what it is, and then explain how we might need to use that hedge. So you're listening to NucleCast, and we'll be right back. This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. And we're back, and we're talking to Brigadier General retired Greg Bowen, and we're talking about the hedge. So I asked you to explain for the audience, what is the hedge, and how might we need to employ it?
So the hedge is maintaining some level of additional capacity in terms of warheads and delivery systems and delivery methods, that in the event of some sort of a significant emergency, we can bring those things to bear. So think of it as you got a full tank of gas in your car, but you keep a couple 5-gallon cans in your garage just in case. That's kind of like the hedge, right? So the power goes out, you've still got a fuel source. So that's kind of conceptually what it is. But in real terms, so we're limited under New START to 1,550 deployed strategic warheads, but we have more than that. So there are some in storage that are part of the hedge. However, the disagreement I have with the way that things are now is the hedge appropriately sized? Can the hedge be quickly implemented, i.e., if we need to re-MIRV the Minutemen, how quickly can we do that? And do we have the ability to do it? Do we have enough warheads sitting in storage? And I don't know the answer to that. There's then other capabilities, as we talked earlier in the discussion about the Slickum N. Having these new capabilities, I think all of that together. So it's its quantity, its quality, and its methodology of delivery. I think that combined is what the hedge is, and the hedge is there just in case things go sideways and we need it.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, and just for your situational awareness, the latest that I've been told is that we can do about a wing, that it would take at least a year to do each wing, 1 to 3 years. And so therefore, if we have 3 wings, we're looking 3+ years out. And that's sort of the optimistic schedule. Of course, this is one of those things. And for those who don't know, we store these warheads. There's parts of them missing. So you can't just pull them out of storage and slap them on, slap a warhead on a Minuteman. This is a very detailed process that takes time. And so it's nothing we can do overnight, which in and of itself is part of our challenge, because as you correctly point out, how quickly can we respond? How effectively can we respond? And I'm skeptical of the utility of the existing hedge, and that we're maintaining what we need, much less sort of this 2022 NPR, hey, we're going to get rid of it. And now for those who might say, hey, listen, the Chinese had a minimal deterrent, 200 or 300 weapons, which we really don't quite know how many they had, but they had a minimum deterrent, and it worked for 60 years. So therefore, why does the United States need to both maintain a hedge and then potentially build new capabilities, slick them in? My favorite, of course, is Pershing 3 and Glickem. Why would we need that if minimum deterrence worked for the Chinese? That surely it will work for us as well. That's the argument people make. So explain, that's wrong, but why might it be wrong?
Well, I go back to the point, Adam, that there's the world we'd like to have and the world we've got. And the world we've got, the Chinese have clearly, and they're very opaque in their military thinking. They don't put stuff out there like we do. But the Chinese have absolutely changed their strategy from one of minimum deterrence to something else. You can make an argument that they're trying to build a first strike. You can make an argument that they want to bolster their ability to deter us before they go into Taiwan. There's a lot of aspects to that, but it has changed. And I remember at the end of the Cold War, when the wall came down and everybody was talking about the peace dividend and we're going to get rid of all this stuff. And people need to realize that as long as, or until such time as the human race evolves past the point where we settle our differences with violence, we're going to need these weapons for deterrence. Deterrence has worked wonderfully since 1945. I know it's hard to prove a negative, but it has kept, there has not been great power war on this planet since 1945. And that, in my view, is because of the deterrent effect of nuclear weapons. So I'm a huge nuclear weapon fan, and we can debate about the eaches. Being a former Army guy, I love Pershing. That was an Army artillery system, man. That was good stuff, and Glickems, and yeah. But it's all about providing multiple things for the enemy to worry about, and the more you've got, the stronger you appear, and the less likely somebody is going to try to test you. And that's really, the bottom line with it. So weakness is dangerous, and I don't think that going into this particular time in history, we can afford to be weak.
Yeah, for those who have made the argument that, well, minimum deterrence worked, so therefore why don't we just maintain what we have? I guess my retort is, well, if it works so well, then why are the Chinese going for parity if it worked that well? Because obviously the Chinese didn't believe it worked. Otherwise, They wouldn't be seeking parity. And now, let me ask you one thing, and then Bob the Genie's going to make his standard appearance. Do you think we need to be thinking about Russia, China, South Korea collectively, and therefore seek parity against all three? Or do you think that we can essentially pivot, if we need to pivot to Russia, almost this, one major conflict and hold approach? Or do we need a 2+1 approach where we can, hold them all both at risk equally? How do you see that?
So with the China, Russia, North Korea, they're all kind of geographically in an area, and their governance is very similar. And I think that could be the cabal that we would need to worry about the most. In my view, I think we need to have sufficient capability to deter them all simultaneously. And if deterrence fails, to be able to fight and win with one of them while managing escalation with the others.
Yeah.
But that briefs well. I couldn't tell you how we would do it. That would be horribly complicated to do. But I'm a realist. I know we don't have unlimited budgets either, so we've got to spend our money wisely. And how do we get the most bang, pun intended, for the buck with these weapons? And frankly, they're if you look at cost avoidance, our nuclear arsenal is cheap. It's cheap insurance compared to what it would cost us if we got into a high-end fight with a peer competitor. So I think more is better, and different capabilities. The more of them, the merrier, in my view.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it was Admiral Richard or General Cotton that said it, but deterrence is far cheaper than fighting. So, and if you look at, take a look at historically, we're spending 3.5% of our GDP on deterrent or on defense, and historically it was about 5%. So we're way down from peacetime Cold War norms. And then if you look at wartime norms, World War II, we spent over half, 50 cents of every dollar Americans made went to fighting war. So building those capabilities to deter, let's say we went from, say, 3.5 to 5. That would still be far cheaper than fighting.
Yeah, and the nuclear deterrence part of the DoD budget is relatively modest.
Yeah.
The DoD spends a lot of money, but it's expensive. Look, I'm a taxpayer. I get that, but it is money well spent, in my view, and that actually segues into the other point I wanted to make. Unless you want to continue to beat the dead horse, but the known unknowns, right? So one of the things that we were starting to think about when I was at Stratcom was Triad recapitalization, and of course the decisions hadn't been made before I retired, but I've been watching that closely. So this is kind of unprecedented in that we are recapitalizing all three legs of the Triad and NC3 at the same time. Now, these are all major, complex weapons programs. And if you look at our track record of past programs, what are the chances that we're going to run into some problem with some element of this recapitalization? So the example I like to talk about is the F-35. It's a really cool little jet. We spent, almost $2 trillion on it. And the last thing that I read, their operational readiness rate was like 48%. Half of them can't fly on any given day. Why is that? Well, they had developmental problems. They found some issues after they started fielding them. They have supply chain problems. It's new technology. It's every new weapon system goes through growing pains. They just do because of the complexity. And I'm not in any way trying to disparage the efforts of all the great engineers and industry people and acquisition folks that run the programs. This is hard stuff.
Sure, absolutely.
But think about this. If you have, so right now, Sentinel, the Minuteman replacement, has already had a Nunn-McCurdy breach. It's got troubles. The Columbia-class submarine replacing the Ohios their schedule's slipping to the right. B-21 looks like it's kind of on track. I haven't heard anything bad about LRSO. and I've heard nothing on NC3 publicly. But just think about we're out of runway on Minuteman and the Ohios. They really can't sustain those very much longer. And what if we have a problem with, say, the Columbia class? Say they build them, and all of a sudden we run into some unknown issue that the engineers didn't get, and it didn't get picked up during developmental or operational testing, and they've got to bring them back in and put them in dry dock to fix whatever this problem is. You just lost 1/3 of your Triad. You could say the same thing if there's a problem with Sentinel, that we can't keep sustaining Minuteman. They're going to have to go away, and the Sentinel's got problems. We could lose a part of the land leg of the Triad. NC3, that glues everything together. That's the underpinning. What if there's issues there that they run into later? This is what worries me. Is we're going to have a problem later on that we didn't anticipate, and the Triad may be a dyad for a while until we get it fixed. That's another really, really powerful reason, in my view, to hedge, to have other systems like Slickum, and I'll throw Pershing at you just to give you a bone, but whatever. We need the ability, if we lose one, to be able to bolster the other ones. And the B-21, yeah, that's cool, but we've still got the buffs. The B-52s are still going to be flying probably well past the end of my lifetime, and they're still highly effective in standoff attacks, but we won't have a penetrating bomber. So there's any number of things that can happen to these highly complex systems and programs, and we've got to hedge for that. We need to. Our going in assumption needs to be something is going to break. We just don't know what it is yet.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. It's a great justification for the hedge writ large. And it's funny. I've got a friend who works for one of the big engineering firms here in Kansas City, and her job is she handles the insurance for, I forget what they call it. They have a special term, but it's the oversights and mistakes that engineering firms may make when they design or build structures, bridges, buildings, whatever. And I had never heard of that.
Yeah, errors and omissions.
Errors and omissions. That's it. Errors and omissions. And I was like, I never heard of this. But your point is, it's kind of makes me think of this idea of errors and omissions, and that we're going to have them on these hugely complex and large scale. That's why we've had such difficulty pricing them, is because they're so complex and they take place over 30 years. So that's just an almost impossible task. So this is a good segue to move into our final segment. Of course, I bring out Bob the Genie, and as I rub my magic lamp, Bob the Genie grants you, Greg, 3 wishes, but only about our topics discussed today. With that in mind, Greg, what is wish number 1?
Gosh, wish number 1 is fully embracing the hedge. We just need to do it, I think, for our national security. That would be wish number 1.
Hug the hedge. I gotcha.
Hug the hedge.
Okay, so wish number 2.
Boy, you're putting me on the spot a little bit. Wish number 2. My initial thought on that, since I can see you, was to give you the name of my barber, but I won't go there.
Hey, I had your haircut for 25 years.
I know. And after I retired, I did try to grow it out, but I was a creepy old guy, so I cut it back off again. Wish number 2 is that we don't have any known unknowns on the Triad recapitalization. Everything works swimmingly. The engineers get it right the first time. The supply chain gives us what we need, and we are good to go.
That's a great wish, actually. That's one nobody's ever wished for. So that's actually a good wish. Okay.
Yep.
Final wish.
Final wish is the people decide that they no longer want to be ruled by folks like Putin and Xi and Kim, and somehow magically China, Russia, North Korea become thriving democracies and peaceful partners as we move forward in life. How's that for some crap?
Well, that was the Wayback Machine that took us back to the 90s because Russia, China, and
yeah.
North Korea were all going to be democracies back then.
We're going to be singing Kumbaya with those guys in no time.
All right. Well, 3 great wishes. Of course, Greg, thanks for joining us. Thanks for talking about the hedge. It's a great topic. It's one we haven't gone in depth about. So thanks for coming on NucleCast to talk about it.
My pleasure. It was wonderful.
And thanks to you, the listeners, for joining us on this episode, and we'll see you next time. Great to chat with Greg Bowen and talk about hedging and options. I enjoyed it. Greg's a wealth of experience and wisdom, and so it was great to talk with him. And the key thing I think that I wish we would have talked more about it earlier in the show was this idea that we have all these programs and we should expect problems, because that's normal with the development of any new complex technology, and therefore hedging is important. So I enjoyed it. Hopefully you did as well.
This has been a production of the NY Deterrence Center, a 501c3 that seeks to educate key decision makers, stakeholders, and the public to ensure a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Grunthal. Help us grow our followers by sharing it, and follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at NucleCast.